Good evening. Welcome to Critical Moves, the program that looks at the geopolitical situation, linking the world on the basis of win-win, where the benefits are shared fairly. A development based on complementarity and not on interference. That's the main objective of the Belt and Road Initiative, which China has been promoting since the beginning of this decade. So how has this initiative been growing following its second international forum? And how is the White House looking at this development from Beijing? Join me for Critical Moves. Our first move takes us to some of the main declarations coming out of that second forum for the Belt and Road International Initiative, which was held last week in Beijing. We will continue to promote connectivity by land, sea, air, and in cyberspace. We'll develop an infrastructure of high quality, which is sustainable, resistant, accessible, and we will develop economic and trade corridors, and we will increase the alignment of markets.
It's
clear that the implementation of the Belt and Road Initiative promoted by our Chinese partners aims to develop connections between the Euro-Asian countries with a focus of sustainable development, economic development in the whole Euro-Asian area. Russia, for its part, has always emphasized that the Belt and Road Initiative will create a better development in Euro-Asia, which includes better alignment between different bilateral and multilateral development projects in Eurasia. Russia is ready to assist this process on a transparent basis and contribute to the development of cooperation and collaboration in our continent and to overcome the fragmentation of world politics and world economic policy. So we need to locate this initiative geographically. In the 21st century, China gave a new impulse to the legendary Silk Road, used since the 3rd century and made immortalized by the Italian explorer Marco Polo. It was the main link between Asia and Europe, going over mountains, plateaus and deserts, 8,000 kilometers of road. In 2013, China launched an initiative to extend new commercial routes along those routes, new land and sea routes connecting, and also commercial and cultural links. The first forum was held in Beijing in 2017, based on mutual trade. The second forum came in April 2019. From the 25th to the 27th of April in Beijing, agreements worth $64 billion were made, and the support for multilateralism in the context of trade sanctions. More than 120 countries make up the initiative, and 19 Latin American nations are taking part. So let's bring us up to date. Let's look at our own website, Telesur. The Belt and Road Initiative closes with $64 billion worth of alliances. The Chinese President Xi Jinping, at the closing event said that the international cooperation were agreed to a value of $64 billion. The Chinese leader said that there were 283 concrete agreements made, and he called on leaders and organizations taking part to join forces to allow high-quality development of the Belt and Road Initiative. A round table at the end of the forum allowed opinions to be exchanged and achieve consensus on the promotion of connectivity, alignment of politics, and closer economic and trade links and towards the United Nations 2030 objectives. It also promoted multilateralism and to respect the market, and that should be an equal and fair market. The Chinese president pointed out the opportunities and results of the forum are being shared across the world. It's a long-term project with a just aim for all its members. And on the debate site, a virtual experience center, a special center applying virtual reality technology dedicated to the Belt and Road Initiative, was open to the public in Beijing since last Sunday. The center, which covers 4,000 square meters to begin with, is in a creative industries park in the center of Beijing. It offers a platform of education for young people to understand the initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, through an immersive experience. The texts, photos, and videos were provided by Xinhua Agency using virtual reality and technologies of interactive projection. The spectators can make an appointment to take part. And I recommend this article by Josefina Martinez in Rebellion, which talks about from Marco Polo to Xi Jinping, Italia joins the Silk Road. The Washington Post has informed the news that 7 cycles after the legendary explorer and trader from Venice, Marco Polo, began on his odyssey across China, the emissaries of Beijing, are now establishing a beachhead in Italy itself. The agreement between Italy and China came as a bombshell for the European partners. This opens another breach amongst the members of the European community, already divided over the Brexit negotiations. The Italian editor of the Washington Post pointed out that according to the Belt and Road, the populist government of Italy is breaking ranks with the most powerful countries in the West, and defying the wishes of the Trump administration. Xi Jinping's tour took him to Italy and France, and when he had an amazing meeting with Macron, Merkel, and Juncker. The French president said, "We have our differences." Obviously, the exercise of power through the history of humanity has always seen rivalries. We're not ingenuous, but we respect China and we're committed to dialogue and cooperation, said Macron. Their differences did not stop them, however, from signing new commercial agreements with China, including the sale of 300 Airbuses to the value of 30 billion euros. So on this, let's talk to our correspondent in Moscow, Hansel Oro. Hello to you and all to our audience. As an alternative to economic protectionism, this Belt and Road initiative from China has arisen. There are now 173 projects, developed with Russia has been playing an important part. President Putin took part in this recent Belt and Road Forum, had an excellent meeting with Xi Jinping where they talked about trade exchanges between the two countries, which have increased by 24% in the last year. On the other hand, at the end of this year, we're expecting the inauguration of a gas pipeline from between China and Russia, and this is called the Force of Siberia pipeline. And this development of a new Silk Road benefits both, but it is concerning the United States. And that's part of the reasons why they're sanctioning Russia. This is a strategy where Russia will play an important role in the development of the sea routes through the Arctic, for example, to favor this commercial exchange and seeking other routes to favor integration and exchange between the nations taking part. It's clearly an alternative to the protectionism now being practiced by the United States. This seeks to besiege these rival economies, but Xi Jinping's initiative is giving rise to a new concept of international relations in a multipolar world. Thank you very much, Hansel. So let's take a pause on critical moves. When we come back, we'll talk about what the new balance of forces that comes out of this new initiative and how is the White House viewing this. Welcome back to Critical Moves. Let's look at another website from Xinhua, a consensus on green and sustainable development in the Road and Belt. The development of ecological development is part of the consensus achieved by the countries taking part in the second forum for the Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing. The Belt and Road Initiative is not just about prosperity, it's also about green development, said the Chinese ecology minister Li Ganjie. In this ecological parallel forum, a proposal was presented for green refrigeration, which tries to increase integration and exchange between the countries involved in the area of air conditioning. China has been proposing the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, through measures of ecological and clean development with standards of sustainability. The Belt and Road Initiative seeks a vision of development which is ecological, low in carbon, and sustainable, says an inform published on the advances of the BRI. As a second proposal, I leave you the article by Raul Zibecki, says the Silk Road involves the United States and Latin America, published by Sputnik. After a new tour of the region, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo firing left and right against China, we can conclude that the backyard is no longer what it was. Although China is advancing in the region, the main question is how it confronts the obstacle. 4 countries are still not part, but China is not in a hurry. It advances where there is least resistance and practices the traditional game of Go. which, different from chess, is not about frontal confrontation, but is about moving, surrounding the enemy until they are isolated. China has agreements with all the countries of the Pacific, except Colombia, who are key for trade in this region. In Go, everything is a question of time, whereas in chess, the principal aim is war, to annihilate the pieces of the enemy. In Go, it's pure strategy, with pieces that all look the same, only with some are black and some are white. So you're occupying space is the key thing. So while Washington is trying to overthrow governments that it considers enemies, China fills up the holes until the big pieces accept their proposal. In this strategy, China has no rivals, and that's why Washington is so increasingly desperate. So how did the idea come up, and how has it developed so far? Let's see the context. The Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2013. Its antecedents go back to the Silk Road 1,300 years ago, which turned China into a powerful empire. Caravans left Shanghai towards the Middle East and Europe to return with spices and metals. Now, the Asian giant is taking infrastructure, and China has already invested $70 billion in the countries who have joined the Belt and Road Initiative. Up until the end of 2017, there were 4,200 new air routes to 42 countries and 39 new train routes, international train routes. The initial is to develop a commercial network with Asia, Africa, and Europe. But countries in the Americas are also joining, like Bolivia, Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago are also joining. It will cover 75% of the world's energy reserves and 55% of the world's GDP. So far, most of the countries integrated into this initiative were developing countries. To have economic development integrated with China, with the financial benefits that implies. Now, industrialized countries are joining, like Italy, after Xi Jinping's trip to Europe, where they signed various agreements. Let's go to the analysis. Jose Antonio Hido joins us from Spain, and from Argentina, Ernesto Matos, economist and international analyst. Welcome to Critical Moves. This policy of non-invasion, non-intervention, which is very different from the United States approach to international development. So what does this mean for the world? Good afternoon. We send our greetings to Telesur and your audience. There are very radical differences. The conception which the United States and other Western countries allied to it have taken has been to capture zones of influence in neo-colonial zones, imposing on them governments and authorities contrary to the local interests, with the aim of pillaging, plundering their natural resources, exploiting their labor force, and in preventing their natural course of development in the Third World or the South. That has nothing to do at all with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is based on very pragmatic agreements promoted by the People's Republic of China, respecting the sovereignty of the other governments. But I would say another thing, this is not incompatible it's very compatible with the Marxist orthodoxy which the Chinese Communist Party, which grounds the idea of development in the development of the productive forces, overcoming the bottlenecks which were seen by Marx in the capitalist mode of production. This is a form of promoting on a world scale the productive forces, which will have geopolitical implications and social implications and will contribute to highlight the great, or overcome some of the great inequalities between countries, which are the product of centuries of original primitive accumulation under capitalism. This is a new model of development, not based on agreements, not on war, based on mutual interests. Really, humanity is on the threshold of a new epoch of economic development on the basis of this Belt and Road Initiative, which is the new modern version for the Silk Road. So let's go to Ernesto Matos, economist and analyst in China. So this is a lot of agreements, a lot of money involved in these new agreements in the forum in Beijing. So what stage is this Belt and Road Initiative at right now? Let's try again to re-establish communication with Ernesto Matos. In the meantime, I'll go back to José Antonio Ejido. This initiative, amongst its different philosophies, talks about preserving the natural environment, and how will this be realized? See, if China is at the head of the contaminating countries. It's true what you say. It's a doubt which is expressed on a recent trip to China. The left-wing Fernández Noroña, a left-wing politician from Mexico, where he asked about the ecological and social cost of the huge economic development of the Popular Republic of China. It's certainly a big challenge. There are several challenges. One of them is the preservation of natural balances. From several international conferences which have drawn attention to this global warming and the environmental degradation. China has always been a very close observer of these international recommendations, which have been recognized by all the governments of the world, with the exception of the United States. It's a challenge for all countries, these problems linked to the environment. It's necessary that modern technologies of development, of energy, of transport and communication, of industrial development, must take into account this variable. China is used to assuming big challenges, and the Belt and Road Initiative, as it has a world dimension, this challenge will be shared with developed European countries who join the initiative, as well as underdeveloped countries, where there is a very interesting proposal before them, which is very distinct from the philosophy of the IMF and the Western monopolies, which didn't lead to any kind of social or environmental balance. But I think that we trust that these challenges will be faced by China and by the dozens of countries linked to this project, which is so important for humanity. Well, at least there's a clear commitment from China to deal with this. Very different to the United States, which has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement, for example. I think we now have communication with Ernesto Matos. So just wait, please wait a moment. José Antonio Hido. Ernesto Matos, we'd like to hear your opinion. We have these 283 agreements, $64 billion of new agreements in this second forum held in Beijing. From your point of view as an economist, what state is the Belt and Road Initiative at now? I think this is part of the plan of Beijing to develop its economic presence in the face of its competition with the United States. But I think that there's I think it's false to think that China is not playing chess. It's trying to dominate the center of this game. There are obviously, I think China is trying to see where the United States is losing influence, where it can advance in the Caribbean, for example, where the withdrawal of US aid, China moves in. And similarly, for example, this was around the recognition of Taiwan. And when the TPP initiative, China took over the leadership of that when the United States withdrew. Many countries on the Pacific Rim so that relation will continue. So
Y eso es el proceso que ha sucedido en América Latina durante los últimos más o menos 15 años.
So in the last 15 years, they've been receiving, Latin American countries have been receiving technology, exporting raw materials. The countries of Latin America will have to see how they deal with these two main centers of power and how they can achieve the development of their own countries. I think China will continue to do what it knows best how to do, to occupy these spaces. I think in this forum for the Belt and Road Initiative, it's similar to what happened in Africa last year. China is already investing more than $120 billion in Africa. It's been promoting a whole logistical system to acquire the raw materials it needs for its own development and technological independence. Has the United States achieved anything from this trade war with China? And yet China continues to grow, expand its international influence through the Belt and Road. The United States has failed. The internal pressures from the farmers who send most 64% of their production to China. So they've had to sit down and negotiate, and China, obviously, with its diplomacy, has shown promoting peace in the Korean Peninsula. But the United States has put its interests in Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, three of the main countries in South America, which haven't signed the Belt and Road Initiative. In the case of Mexico, is a separate case. That will be a different challenge. now with the government of AMLO. I think the United States is trying to see how it can advance in its discourse and how it's the idea of interference, all U.S. interference. The idea that U.S. interference and Chinese interference is the same. And that's a discourse which has been promoted by the United States to try and minimize the influence of China. But it's been seen explicit with the attempted coup in Venezuela. We see that it's very different. We've seen what happened this week in Venezuela, and it seems to be another defeat for the United States and the regional right in its desire to take control of the biggest oil reserves in the world. Thank you, Ernesto. Dr. Ejido, one final question. Given all this, with all this analysis, so what is the balance of forces between the East and the West now? I think it's clearly in favor of the East. This East is the industrial driving force of humanity. It's in the East, particularly in China, where there are rates of growth which have beaten all records and overcome counteracted the crises in the West. It's from the East that such audacious initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative are emerging. It's from the East, it's towards the East that the peoples of Africa, the Caribbean, Latin America are looking. Because before they've been since we have looked at the case of Korea, where a climate of stability will produce a much more important economic integration between the two parts of Korea, the case of Vietnam, which is overcoming the consequences of the terrible war that the United States imposed, Indonesia. This East is winning the game, and the West is obliged or is in danger of sinking into instability, wars, destabilization of governments. What's happening with Venezuela this year is indescribable. What's happened in the last 8 years in Syria, a result of Western policies linked to the traffic of oil and gas, is a violation of all principles that humanity has built up. So the Orient is now a beacon of stability and development, with China leading that process on several levels, politically, economically, and geopolitically, with a world influence which I think will be beneficial to overcome the phase of imperialist capitalism, which was already called 100 years ago the most reactionary phase of capitalism. Thank you very much, Dr. Ejido. Thank you for your analysis for critical moves. Let's go to another pause. When we come back, we'll be talking to another specialist in our studio to ask how this readjustment of the world geopolitics, the chess board, how does it stand now? Stay with us. So, with that picture of the world, we're talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. So what have been the geopolitical impacts of this so far? Let's have a look. The Belt and Road Initiative questions the U.S. hegemony and its incapacity to offer beneficial alliances with other countries. With the advance of the Chinese strategy, the White House has tried to develop agreements with neighboring countries like India, Japan, Australia, or they have a close trading ties with the United States. Countries like India have had their differences. The Chinese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in November 2017 promoted behind his country, the United States, Australia and India, the so-called open Indo-Pacific strategy. In this context, China has managed to get some American countries to join its strategy, and that worries the White House, who thinks our region as a secure place for its investments and trade. In a recent tour of Latin America, James Mattis, the Defense Secretary and head of the Pentagon, said that the increasing influence of China would be a threat to countries in the region, but that's something that has far from happening with the agreements signed with Latin America, where Xi Jinping has respected the autonomy and independence of those countries. This warning shows the Achilles heel of the Monroe Doctrine, taken up by the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and also by Donald Trump when he spoke to the UN in September 2018. So the achievements are not just commercial, they go much further. They're political and geopolitical. That's why we're going to invited Professor José Manuel Rodríguez López from the Venezuelan Observatory of Economic Reality. Hello, welcome. So, we're talking about this initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative, and its geopolitical dimensions. Your other guests have been talking about the commercial. There are other dimensions we have to analyze. The increasing instability of the world financial system, which has been widely talked about, the use by the United States of payment methods as a way of destroying countries, using the SWIFT platform, which is the international payment system, have threatened the members of the SWIFT platform based in Europe that they will be persecuted if they go to Iran, if they allow Iran to use the SWIFT payment system. In Venezuela, they've used another means. They've prevented the central bank from doing business in dollars and trying to close down its trade. So on this side too, China is also advancing. It's no longer the Silk Road. We're talking about the Chinese. If they want to move large amounts of investments, they have to have a way of moving that money and a judicial framework for that. This platform is being built in Asia. The Pike company, which is the Asian, deals with about 90% of movements in Asia. These none of them. China, through an agreement with Russia, have an agreement for international financial exchange where China receives in rubles and Russia receives in yuan. There's also a system of inter-Asian payment system based on the Pi. But for the moment, the dollar is still prevalent. So these new instruments, like the yuan oro instrument, to deal in oil with China. The petro is also a platform. It's had some advances and retreats. But through these mechanisms, China, for China, 100 is nothing. There's no problem. Although they've made big advances, very important ones, in less than a decade. Now, in a few years or months, they're going to be mounting the 5G, essentially speeding up 10, 20, 100 times the velocity of internet connections. China, more than anything else, more than winning in trade terms, in terms of the reserves it can draw, is to maintain its interconnections with the world. If you look at if you put trade relations with internet connections, with financial connections, this is a complete system. The debt is the basis of the financial system. Yeah? And with all this can happen, these payments can happen in terms of yuanes. When you finish that, my connection is quicker than yours. I charge you less commission on the financial exchange. And you have a yuan or gold bond. You're mentioning some key names on this board. So we have Venezuela, if the United States, Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, the axis of evil in this part of the world. But for China, this is the axis of benefit. An important part of Iran's oil is sold to China, for example. The Chinese are waiting for a rupture, and they're prepared. Hide your strengths until the moment is right. And sometimes China will say, this is my platform for payments. You can pay me by this, or you can pay me by SWIFT as well. China is waiting for this tremor, but not with their arms crossed. China's strength depends a lot on the seas. The South China Sea, that's not controlled by them. There's a big U.S. presence there. This is why there's a conflict in the South China Sea, in these islands. And that's why China is trying to expand its continental shelf there. Militarily, its capacity to respond to a coalition-led coalition is they can't, at this point, respond. It's quite easy to block that trade. So militarily, so China developing its land connections with high-speed trains. First connection with Italy. Well, okay, explain that to me. This in Italy, where they've just signed an agreement, because Italy has a big financial crisis. It's not getting the help it needs from the European Union. So, China arrives and said we can develop some ports. and you can get involved in the transport, but not in the maritime platforms that are controlled by enemies, but then across land. And so they can transport stuff across Russia, of course, because China and Russia historically have seen each other as rivals, as competitors, with some skirmishes. China has had problems with India. This whole situation has evolved. Doesn't mean they're their best friends, but they want to do secure business. And it's very important. There's another route that's being developed, the polar route, to move commodities across the ice of the Arctic Circle, because then the US and its allies would have to try and augment their presence to block those routes. When we talk about the financial system and these trade routes, it's very important for China lend money and they pay back with services, with goods. This is the basis of the financial system that's with its 5G backup in terms of communications. Therefore, that's why they don't. The US doesn't want China to develop stable relations. How are you? This whole scheme is being developed. I think it's quite advanced. How much will Latin America benefit from this initiative? I think it's an important discussion here. One of the countries with the most trade with China is Brazil. Argentina also sells a great deal. Chile already has bilateral agreements. There's the Chinese Development Bank has its main agency in Chile. In Nicaragua, there was the proposal for a new canal built by the Chinese, and Venezuela is one of the main energy suppliers and one of the whole of Latin America will have an impact here. Mexico, because of its bilateral agreement with the United States, more or less demands that they don't do business with China. This was signed by Enrique Peña Nieto and the new president, AMLO. Andrés Manuel López Obrador is trying to see how to resolve this, because technically Mexico is outside of this initiative, out of this business with China. And that's a big problem for Mexico. But it's already signed the new trade agreement with the Mexico-Canada-US agreement. Since Latin America has close relations, the change of position for Brazil the question is whether they want to continue doing business with China. What will happen to the countries who don't join this Chinese initiative? The Chinese are doing business. It's not this business about, you're either with me or against you. It's not the US vision. If all your How are you going to resist China if everything you use was made in China? So many of the things imported in Latin America come from Asia. They come through the Panama Canal. So what about the Trump's policies of protectionism. Economically speaking, a trade opening would destroy their internal market. So Chinese role in the world economy came through an agreement signed with US President Nixon to develop their productive capacity. North American countries moving to China, beginning to manufacture in China with very, very cheap labor.
Es muy barata, ¿ves?
Tanto que relatively very cheap.
Huawei acaba de vender más
has sold more
casi 5% más
cell phones, 5% more than Apple.
Pero es que Apple es fabricación china también.
But Apple is also made in China.
20 y tantos % de los teléfonos, casi su suma más o menos tiene que ser 30 y pico % de los teléfonos celulares del mundo son fabricados en China.
So 30% or more of the world's cell phones are made in the world are made in China, whether they're Apple or Huawei. Huawei is like the Chinese iPhone. iPhone's not working with 5G.
O sea, mira, si quieres ir lo suficientemente rápido vas a tener que tener esto.
If you want to go as quickly,
the
North Americans are mounting this attack on Huawei that they have to, because they have to buy parts from China which they don't have. And the European version of 5G is 5 times more expensive.
No te puedes decir que te vas a resistir al barco. No,
you can't resist that.
Es tener una opción. Lo puedes hacer
you have an option
el sistema financiero anglosajón, que es basado en Londres.
With the Anglo-Saxon financial system based in London and New York, or you're going to go
Taiwán, o sea, inclusive estoy hablando de Taiwán, o sea, hay que estén en conflicto,
sí,
pero hacen negocios, muchos negocios, y está Hong Kong.
So, or the alternative with...
La política de la economía.
Por supuesto,
Profesor, $1 millón de gracias.
Okay. Professor, thank you very much for helping us to understand what's behind this initiative, the Belt and Road Initiative. Now, the conclusions.
Como vemos,
so, while the imperial eagle continues to base itself on the law of the strongest, with commercial sanctions and financial blockades, the dragon is flying, including in the lands of the Americas, opening up roads, gaining partners. That's what the Belt and Road Initiative is about. Let's see what the next moves of China will be. That's for next time.